You can love your family and still feel like a guest at their table, watching a conversation you were never quite taught the rules of. Most people assume closeness comes from shared blood. Closeness is actually built through repetition, and repetition can quietly fail even inside the same house year after year without anyone noticing it happening. That failure rarely announces itself with an argument. It shows up in smaller signals first. A joke lands for everyone at the table except you. A shared memory gets retold in a version you don't recognize. A silence gets filled differently than everyone expects you to fill it. None of these moments feel significant on their own. Together, they build a pattern that outlasts any single disagreement. Family therapist Murray Bowen studied families as emotional systems rather than collections of individuals, and he traced this pattern to something he called differentiation, a person's ability to hold their own thoughts and reactions separate from the family's shared emotional mood. In some households, differentiation is welcomed as a sign of growth. In others, it reads as disloyalty. A child who notices, questions, or feels differently from the group can end up fluent in a private language nobody else in the house speaks. So why does one sibling feel completely at home while another feels like a permanent visitor, raised under the identical roof, eating the identical meals, hearing the identical stories? Psychologist Judith Rich Harris offered a piece of the answer. Her research into group socialization argued that children are shaped less by their parents directly and more by their peer groups and wider culture surrounding them. If your strongest sense of belonging formed outside the house through friends, interests, or a world your family never entered, the house itself can start to feel like a familiar stranger, present every single day, understood rarely. Here is where the pattern becomes measurable rather than just felt. Sociologist Carl Pillemer's research into family estrangement found that roughly 1 in 4 adults reports a significant rift with a relative. Almost none of them point to a single dramatic event as the cause. Instead, they describe accumulation, small mismatches repeated for years, never named out loud until the distance became the entire relationship. That accumulation is the real insight here. Feeling foreign inside your own family is rarely evidence that something is broken in you. It is frequently evidence that you developed a self distinct enough to notice the mismatch in the first place. And noticing requires exactly the kind of separateness that closeness alone cannot produce. Zoom out further, and the modern nuclear household starts to look like an unusual arrangement rather than a natural one. For most of human history, children were raised inside extended kin networks. Aunts, cousins, elders, and neighbors sharing the work of child-rearing across many adults, not concentrated inside 2 parents and their own biological offspring. Closeness in that arrangement came from the sheer volume of shared daily contact across a wide group, not from a small household expecting a handful of people to meet every emotional need for each other. Judged against that older pattern, the modern expectation that one small unit should provide total belonging looks less like a birthright and more like a demanding, historically recent experiment. There is a limit to this reframe worth naming honestly. Not every estrangement traces back to differentiation or mismatched temperaments. Some families are genuinely harmful, and distance from them is not a failure of understanding to repair, but a reasonable response to actual mistreatment. The ideas here describe the far more common, quieter version. Families where love was present, but fluency in each other was never built. Not families where safety itself was the problem. Philosophy has circled this same problem for centuries, particularly through the idea that identity is constructed rather than simply inherited. If a self is built through choices, values, and years of private reflection, then 2 people can share a home, a surname, even a childhood, and still arrive at genuinely different selves by adulthood. Blood explains proximity. It never explains understanding. Understanding has to be built on purpose, and it can fail to get built even in a house where love was never actually absent. This reframes the guilt so many people carry about the distance. The instinct is to treat the gap as a personal failure, as though enough effort on your part would have closed it years ago. But some gaps exist because two people were never taught to speak fluently in the same emotional language, not because either of them deliberately refused to learn it. None of this means the distance is permanent. Family systems thinking suggests two practical starting points for anyone ready to close part of the gap. The first is naming this specific mismatch instead of writing off the whole relationship. Identify exactly which topic, memory, or unspoken expectation creates the disconnect, rather than treating the entire bond as unsalvageable. And say it out loud to the person involved, rather than only rehearsing it privately. Specificity makes a real conversation possible, where vague resentment never could. The second is choosing one low-stakes, repeatable interaction to rebuild familiarity in. A shared weekly call, a small recurring activity, a standing invitation. Anything repeated often enough to create new common ground, rather than relying on old childhood memories to carry the whole relationship on their own. Repetition built the distance in the first place. Deliberate repetition is also the only thing capable of rebuilding it. Differentiation was never about rejecting closeness. It was about choosing that closeness honestly and on purpose, instead of assuming it would simply happen because you shared a last name. You can love your family and still feel like a guest at their table, but the table was never the whole relationship. The relationship is whatever you choose to keep building, one honest, deliberate interaction at a time.